Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling source material that's incredibly important, but also, let's be honest, quite difficult. We're digging into the reflections from an international IPA Thinking Lab, that's the International Psychoanalytical Association. This group, a collection of expert clinicians, they met several times earlier this year, and they focused intensely on one thing: suicidality and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So our mission here for this deep dive is pretty crucial. We really want to pull out the key insights about the psychological challenge of suicidality. We need to understand the patient's internal world, which is often, unbearable. But just as vital is understanding the profound, sometimes really destabilizing effects this has on the clinician trying to help.
Yeah, the weight of this topic is unique. When suicidality comes into the therapy room, it just immediately forces these urgent existential questions to the surface. And it presents this acute threat to what we call psychic containment, that ability for either person, patient, or therapist to hold intense emotions without getting completely overwhelmed.
Hmm.
And that threat, it applies to both. It really does. What was striking reading the sources was what the group observed about the field itself. They pointed out there's often a real lack of formalized exposure to theories of suicide during, say, training.
Really, despite how common it must be.
Exactly. Clinicians are quite likely to encounter patients struggling with this. And this leads to a situation where therapists often carry this immense emotional load alone. The group found there are very few places, really, where clinicians felt safe to openly talk about their own struggles, their anxieties around these cases.
That really shifts things, doesn't it? It's not just a technical issue then, it's deeply human.
Okay, so to help us navigate this complex material, we'll structure our deep dive around maybe three core themes. First, the surprising psychic function suicidal behavior can sometimes serve. Second, the huge role of shame and that feeling of the self just collapsing. And finally, that incredibly difficult tightrope clinicians walk between, therapeutic distance and deep human engagement.
Right. Let's unpack that first point, starting with the theoretical roots, how psychoanalysis first tried to make sense of suicide. If you go back to classical Freud, the initial idea was that suicide was a form of aggression. Aggression meant for someone else, an external figure, a lost or disappointing object, which then got turned inward through identification. It was also linked to a really harsh internal critic, the superego.
And later on, Freud connected this to his concept of the death drive,
Yeah.
right? That sort of abstract idea of a fundamental destructive urge towards an inanimate state, release. Yes, the death drive idea is definitely in the mix. But the sources really highlight a critical shift in perspective, discussed by thinkers like Schmidt-Hellerau. They suggest we shouldn't just see the death drive here as purely destructive. Instead, it might be framed as, a desperate attempt at self-preservation.
Hold on, self-preservation through self-destruction. That sounds like a major paradox. How does the Thinking Lab explain that? How can wanting to die actually be about preserving the self?
Well, it is about ending unbearable pain, yes, but it's more specific. It's about the need for release, for relief from emotional pain that's become so overwhelming, so intolerable, that the self feels it literally cannot survive continuing in that state. So the suicidal act, in this view, is an attempt to resolve this unbearable inner conflict. Even if the resolution is, regression or annihilation, the self is trying to survive the experience of the moment by ending the moment itself.
Okay, so if the drive isn't just to die, but to end this specific intolerable psychic suffering, then where does that suffering originate? Did the Thinking Lab explore the roots of this unbearable pain?
Absolutely. And this ties straight into object relations theory, particularly Winnicott's ideas.
Right.
When you look at early childhood, suicidality often seems rooted in what Winnicott called early environmental failure, specifically a lack of adequate holding and disrupted object continuity. If you don't internalize that feeling of a reliable, sustaining presence early on, the adult self just lacks the internal scaffolding, the resources to maintain stability when a major crisis hits.
Right. So if those foundations are shaky, because that early holding environment wasn't quite there, that leads us right to the core dynamic the Thinking Lab identified:
Mhm.
injuries to self-esteem and, what's the phrase they use? Narcissistic mortification.
Mm.
Let's pause on that phrase, mortification. It sounds intense. When you talk about losing self-esteem leading to narcissistic mortification, what does that actually mean? Is it just feeling really, really embarrassed?
Oh, it's much, much deeper than embarrassment. Self-esteem, it's your basic confidence in your own worth, your abilities. Narcissistic mortification is that terrifying, annihilating feeling when that confidence is utterly shattered. It's a psychic collapse. It's like a defensive reaction when the gap between who you feel you are and who you feel you should be becomes just unbearable. And linking back to Winnicott again, healthy self-esteem starts way back with the infant's experience of agency, feeling their actions have an effect, and the basic reliability of their caregivers and environment. That foundation lets us tolerate our own limitations later. But if that foundation is weak, then even smaller injuries later in life, a relationship ending, losing a job, feeling like a failure, can feel absolutely catastrophic, like they threaten your very existence.
And in that state of collapse, the suicidal crisis then serves a kind of terrible psychological function. It gets triggered maybe by losing people or situations that were propping up the patient's sense of worth, these narcissistic self-objects. And the action, or even just the intense thoughts, become a way to avoid something even worse than death, what the lab called the Terry of self-dissolution.
Exactly, self-dissolution.
That sounds like total erasure. How does the mind get to a point where physical annihilation seems like the only escape from that internal terror?
It really centers on shame, unbearable shame. The Thinking Lab stressed that this kind of shame is so psychically disorganizing, so fragmenting, that destroying the self can feel like the only way out. The patient's mind just collapses under the strain. There's no safe internal space, so destroying the body becomes kind of the only way to escape the constant gaze of this internalized, condemning object, that critical, judging figure from the past now inside them.
Yeah, and this internal dynamic captures what Menninger described in his classic triad of suicidal wishes. Remember that. The wish to die to end the suffering, the wish to kill, destroying that condemning internal part, and the wish to be killed, submitting to that unbearable attack. Suicide then becomes this awful, dramatic enactment involving all three at once.
Wow. That idea of internal warfare, it really helps understand the intrusive quality of the patient's despair.
Yeah.
Let's shift focus a bit now to the therapy relationship itself and this idea of containment. The group noted something quite frightening, that suicidality seems to impair the ability to think clearly. And crucially, this happens not just in the patient, but in the therapist too.
It sounds almost like a psychological paralysis, inducing panic, maybe magical thinking, and a collapse of reflection, what they call tunnel vision.
It is a profound disruption. The suicidal threat viewed this way isn't just words, it's an unconscious communication. It's a way to show the therapist and maybe try to master this desolate internal state. Because the patient can't possibly hold this overwhelming affective excess inside, they project it outwards. So the therapist often gets sort of recruited unconsciously to suffer or metabolize these raw, unstructured emotional fragments that the patient simply cannot manage.
So the patient is essentially flooding the room with raw despair and terror.
In a way, yes. And the therapist is suddenly having to hold feelings that are so primitive, so painful, they can feel almost like trauma. And the therapist feels that in their own mind and body.
And this need for someone else to process it feels incredibly primal. The discussions mention Esther Bick's idea that suicidal patients often lack an internal sustaining object, no reliable inner sense of safety or comfort, which leads to this desperate, almost physical search for containment in the therapist. Like they need to be held psychically inside the therapist's mind.
Absolutely. And this is precisely where countertransference, the therapist's own emotional reaction, becomes such a vital source of information. It's not just noise, it's data. The clinicians in the lab talked about experiencing everything from real fear and profound helplessness to irritation and even sometimes an overwhelming tenderness. These reactions aren't signs of failure. They're critical clues about the patient's internal world, what's being projected into the therapist.
When the clinicians talked about their own reactions, were there particular ones they found most challenging? Or maybe ones that tended to lead towards those dangerous enactments you mentioned?
Well, the ones linked to irritation and helplessness seem particularly tricky. Helplessness can sometimes push a therapist towards boundary collapse, trying too hard to fix things, maybe stepping outside the therapeutic frame in unhelpful ways. And irritation, if not understood, can lead to subtle withdrawal or rejection, which, as we discussed with the shame dynamic, is the patient's deepest fear reenacting that relationship with the condemning internal object. The key insight, really, was the absolute necessity of maintaining a holding environment, one that can tolerate these incredibly intense projections of despair and dependency without either collapsing itself or sort of hitting back.
Okay, so this takes us right to the heart of the clinical challenge the Thinking Lab grappled with. How on earth does a therapist maintain that classical analytic neutrality, that non-judgmental stance, without effectively abandoning the patient in a moment of true psychic emergency, when their life might actually be on the line? It feels like, well, an impossible bind.
It really is the ultimate tightrope walk. The lab drew a very fine but I think profound distinction here. They suggested that therapists need to allow the possibility of suicide by acknowledging it as a real psychic fact for the patient. This means truly recognizing the depth of the patient's despair, witnessing their internal reality without immediately trying to argue them out of it or push it away.
So it's about validating the patient's internal truth, like saying, yes, I hear you. I see that you feel you must destroy yourself to escape this pain, while at the same time maintaining that holding function and absolutely not condoning the actual act of suicide.
Exactly. That's an incredibly fine line.
Yeah.
But of course, the intense emotion, the real-world threat, it naturally challenges that professional distance, which brings up the risk of enactments, where the therapist gets unconsciously pulled into the patient's self-destructive patterns.
The group mentioned Ash's concept of the hidden executioner. What exactly does that refer to in this context? It sounds ominous.
It is ominous. It points to the terrifying unconscious roles that can get assigned to the therapist. The patient projects their death wish, their self-attack. If the therapist isn't incredibly aware of their own countertransference, their own reactions, they might unconsciously get maneuvered into fulfilling that role, maybe by subtly rejecting the patient or failing them in some way that confirms the patient's deepest fears. The sources actually mentioned a tragic case example where it was felt in retrospect that a patient's suicide might have been linked to perceived emotional rejection in the therapy sessions. It's a devastating illustration of how that dynamic can potentially play out.
Gosh. If we link this back then, especially thinking about Goldblatt's work with suicidal adolescents that the lab discussed, what does this tell us about the importance of the therapeutic connection itself, even when the outcome feels really uncertain?
Yeah, Goldblatt's work is a crucial reminder that suicidality in younger people often flares up around unbearable developmental pressures, separating from family, figuring out identity, dealing with intense peer or family conflict. And the quality of the therapeutic encounter, even if the therapy doesn't last or gets disrupted, that encounter itself becomes a really important part of the patient's psychic history. The absolute baseline goal, regardless of how stable things become, is that the patient feels fundamentally taken seriously,
Yeah.
that their immense suffering was seen, acknowledged, and witnessed by another human being.
So if we try to bring all these threads together, what we've described is this therapeutic space that's often just flooded with the patient's panic and despair. It's desperate, it's intrusive, it's incredibly challenging. But the group also emphasized that within this intensity, there are these vital moments of connection, maybe hope, and the real potential for change. The therapist becomes all at once a container, a target for the patient's deepest fears, and sometimes maybe the only lifeline they feel they have.
Precisely. And that question, the Thinking Lab kept coming back to, what is the necessary therapeutic stance that became the final focus? Because those boundaries between life and death, self and other, helping and harming, they become incredibly blurred. Their conclusion was that the stance can't be rigidly neutral, nor can it be completely engulfed by the patient's panic. It has to be, and these were their words, responsive, human, and aware. The therapist's capacity to, in a sense, suffer with the patient what the patient cannot bear alone, to genuinely hold and metabolize that fear and despair, and crucially, to survive that experience themselves. That seems to be the core transformative dynamic.
That leaves us, and you listening, with a really provocative thought to carry away from this deep dive. If that unbearable, mortifying shame is rooted in the imagined critical gaze of an internal condemning figure, how might the simple yet profound act of genuine, non-judgmental witnessing that responsive human presence the lab had called for, how might that begin the incredibly complex, often painful, but essential process of building, perhaps for the first time, that missing internal sustaining object? Something to reflect on.